Hello students. So today I'll cover the properties of propositional logic, which is also called propositional calculus. So there are five properties which is held by any propositional logic. The first is valid, second is satisfiable, third is unsatisfiable, fourth is logical equivalence, and the fifth is logical consequence. The first one, that is, any well-formed formula is valid if all interpretations satisfy it or it is true for all values of its input. So, if it is not, then it would be invalid. So, all true statements are called tautology. So, we do have an example that if we said P or not P, whose value or whose interpretation will always be true for its inputs. So, we called it as a valid sentence. And invalid sentence, if any one does not satisfy it, or at least one does not satisfy it, then we call such statement as invalid statement. Now the second property is satisfiable, and any well-formed formula is satisfiable if there is at least one interpretation that satisfies it, or at least one interpretation it is true. So example P and Q, because while creating the truth values of P and Q, we have at least one value which could be true. So the statement is said to be satisfiable. The third property, which is called unsatisfiable, or we called it as contradiction, if there is no interpretation which is true. So we do have an example, that is P and not P, whose value would be always false. So we call such kind of well-formed formula as unsatisfiable or contradiction. The fourth one, that is logical equivalent. So any two proposition can be called as logical equivalent if and only if they have identical truth values for all the inputs on that proposition variables. So if it is so we call such kind of propositions as logical equivalent. So if I say P and double negation of P, so both the truth values would be the same. So we can say that P and double negation of P are logically equivalent. The last property, that is logical consequence, any well-formed formula is called as logical consequence if and only if for every interpretation in which all the premises are true, the conclusion is also true. So we can say that the premise can conclude with something is logically equivalent. So we do have here two statements. The one, P implies Q or R and not R, and P implies Q. So if I try to prove that, then the statement S2 is also true in all of these rows or models. If it is, then every model that satisfies S1 automatically satisfies S2. So in that case, we can say S2 is logically equivalent to S1. Now the next topic, that is inference rules in propositional logic. So we do have some inference rules. The first rule is addition. That is, if P is true, P or Q would always be there. Simplification, if P and Q is true, obviously we can simplify that P would be true. Modus ponens, which is very important, if P is true and P implies Q is true, then we can reduce Q from there, so then Q would also be true. And its opposite, that is modus tollens, if not Q is true and P implies Q is true, then not P can be deduced from it. Disjunctive syllogism, if P or Q is true and not P is true, then obviously Q would be true. Hypothetical syllogism, if P implies Q and Q implies R, so obviously it can deduce P implies R. And conjunction, if P is true and Q is true, so obviously the conjunction of P and Q would also be true. So there are some inference rules in propositional logic which can be used to prove any statement's validation or any argument's validation. So we do have some questions over there. That is your home assignments. Question number 1, that is you need to derive S from the following premises using a valid argument. Valid arguments are these inference rules. So on the basis of these inference rules, we need to derive S from these given statements. First, P implies Q, Q implies not R, P or S R. Question number 2, that is we need to show that these two statements are equivalent. These two WFFs are equivalent. Question number 3, we need to show that this WFF is a tautology. And question number 4, we need to construct a truth table for this WFF. So these are the four questions. Hope you will understand today's lecture and you will solve these questions. In the next lecture, we will discuss about the conjunctive normal formula in propositional logic. Thank you, students. Keep watching and listening.